Watch how someone who is exceptionally good at navigating complex social situations moves through the world, and you'll notice something strange. They don't seem to have a fixed personality. They're different with different people, different in different contexts, different depending on the stakes and the situation. With their boss, they're professional and focused. With their close friends, they're looser and funnier. In a conflict, they're calm and rational. In a moment of celebration, they're genuinely excited. And here's what's strange about this. Their fluidity doesn't read as fake. It reads as adaptive. It reads as self-aware. Meanwhile, someone else is rigidly maintaining their identity across every context, insisting on being themselves, no matter who's in the room or what the situation demands, and they're constantly colliding with reality. They're creating enemies where alliances could exist. They're hitting walls that other people seem to slide around. So what is the difference between someone whose adaptability makes them seem dishonest and someone whose adaptability makes them seem incredibly intelligent? And why is it that the most powerful people are almost never the ones insisting on being authentically themselves in every single situation? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about human nature and about the story we've been told regarding authenticity. We have been taught over and over that the goal is to find your true self and then be that self consistently. That authenticity means the same person in every context, that changing yourself for different situations is dishonest or weak. This narrative is comforting because it suggests that once you figure out who you are, you're done. You can just be that person forever. But this narrative is also spectacularly wrong as a strategy for navigating modern social reality. The people who are most successful, most respected, and most influential are almost never the ones who have a rigid personality that they're defending at all costs. They are the ones who have understood that context is king, that different situations demand different presentations of self, and that the ability to fluidly move between different modes of being is one of the most valuable skills a human being can develop. This is not about being fake. This is about understanding something that most people spend their entire lives denying, that you are already multiple people. You already behave differently with your parents than you do with your friends. You already present yourself differently at a job interview than you do at a casual dinner. You already respond differently when you're tired versus when you're energized. The notion that there is a fixed true self that should be expressed consistently in every context is not just unrealistic, it's a strategic liability. The person who is rigidly the same in every situation is the person whose patterns can be predicted, whose buttons can be pressed, whose responses can be anticipated. The person who fluidly adapts to context is the person who is nearly impossible to manipulate because people can never quite pin down how they're going to respond. Think about what actually happens when someone insists on being authentically themselves, no matter the context. A person who is deeply independent and values autonomy might present that same defiant independence to an authority figure who could actually help them, and they've just created a dynamic where that person is unlikely to help because they've triggered a defensive response. A person who is extremely extroverted and needs constant social stimulation might present that same need in a one-on-one meeting with someone who values quiet depth, and they've just communicated that they're not capable of genuine connection. A person who is brutally honest might express that same brutal honesty about someone's appearance or talent in front of a group, and they've just positioned themselves as someone who lacks discretion, someone who can't be trusted with sensitive information, someone who puts their authenticity above group cohesion. The rigid person is creating friction at every turn with people and situations that don't naturally align with their fixed presentation of self. Compare this to someone who has learned the art of fluidity. They come into a meeting where serious decisions are being made and they are measured, thoughtful and appropriately professional. They understand that this is not the time for their full personality. They go to a celebration with close friends, and suddenly they're loose, funny, fully present in a different way. They encounter someone who is defensive, and they approach with gentleness and curiosity rather than their usual directness. They encounter someone who respects strength, and they show strength. They encounter someone who respects vulnerability, and they show vulnerability. This person is not being dishonest in any of these contexts. They are being contextually intelligent. They are being aware that different situations have different requirements, different social climates, different unspoken rules. And by adapting to those contexts, rather than forcing the same presentation into every situation, they move through the world with remarkable ease. Here's where it gets strategically sophisticated. The person who is adaptable is actually far more powerful than the person who is rigidly consistent because they cannot be easily opposed. You can organize against a person whose behavior is predictable. You can predict what they'll do or say in a given situation, and you can prepare a response. You can identify their triggers and intentionally activate them. You can corner them by putting them in situations where their fixed presentation of self doesn't work. But a person who fluidly adapts to context, that person is nearly impossible to corner because they don't respond the way you expect. They don't defend when you attack. They might acknowledge your point. They don't compete when you challenge them. They might collaborate. They don't withdraw when you criticize. They might ask a genuine question because they don't have a rigid identity they're defending. They don't respond defensively to attacks on that identity. This fluidity is a form of power that rigid people simply cannot access. Let's look at how this actually manifests in a workplace context, because this is where the difference becomes undeniable. There's a person who has decided that they are the independent type, or the guy who doesn't play politics, or the woman who speaks her mind no matter what. This person presents this same identity in every interaction. They don't network much because networking feels political. They don't adapt their communication style for different audiences because that would be inauthentic. They maintain the same stance whether they're talking to their peer or the person with hiring power. And what happens? They plateau. They're seen as limited, as unable to work within systems, as not team-oriented, as difficult. Their authenticity has become a liability because it's rigid and contextually inappropriate. Now consider someone who has understood fluidity. This person has a core set of values, but they present themselves differently in different contexts. With a peer, they're collaborative and equal. With someone who is threatened by them, they're genuinely interested in what the other person thinks and asks questions. With someone who is their competition, they're professional and courteous, but maintain boundaries. With someone who values results, they talk about results. With someone who values relationships, they talk about connection. With authority, they show respect for position. With those reporting to them, they show genuine interest in their development. This person is not being fake in any meaningful sense. They're being aware. And as a result, they move through their workplace with far less friction, far more alliances, far more opportunities, because they're not constantly creating unnecessary conflicts by presenting the same personality into every situation. The same principle applies in romantic contexts, and this is where people particularly struggle because romantic culture tells us that love means the other person accepts all of you, and therefore you should present all of yourself all the time. But watch what actually happens in relationships that thrive versus relationships that struggle. In struggling relationships, someone insists on being the same no matter what's happening, no matter what the other person needs. They are rigidly themselves, even when the situation is demanding something different. And the other person, over time, often experiences this not as authenticity, but as narcissism, as an inability to attune to their needs, as a refusal to meet them where they are. In thriving relationships, people are capable of being different things at different times. When the other person needs gentleness, they provide gentleness. When the other person needs strength, they provide strength. When they themselves need something, they can ask for it without it being a referendum on their identity. The fluidity is not deception, it's attunement, it's emotional intelligence. It's the ability to be present to what the situation is actually asking for, rather than rigidly insisting on being the same person, regardless of context. Here's something that psychologists have known for decades, but that popular culture has resisted acknowledging. Human beings are already contextual creatures. You already have different aspects of your personality that emerge in different contexts. The introvert who is quiet at parties might be talkative with close friends. The person who is aggressive in competition might be gentle with children. The person who is bold in their career might be cautious in new social situations. These are not contradictions. These are the natural expression of being a complex human being with different facets that are activated by different contexts. The problem arises when someone decides that only one of these facets is the true self and all the others are inauthentic. They then spend enormous energy maintaining that one facet while suppressing all the others, and the result is someone who seems one-dimensional and brittle, the person who has integrated all of their facets, who can access different modes of being without feeling like they're being dishonest, has become fluid. And this fluidity is actually more authentic than rigid consistency because it's responsive to reality. It's saying, I am flexible enough to respond appropriately to what's actually happening, rather than insisting that what's actually happening needs to conform to my fixed presentation of self. This is the kind of authenticity that is truly powerful. It's not about being the same person in every context. It's about being genuinely responsive in each context. Let's talk about what this actually requires, because fluidity is more demanding than rigidity in certain ways. It requires self-awareness. You have to actually know which facets of yourself exist and which context activate them. It requires emotional maturity. You have to be comfortable with the fact that you're different with different people and that this is not dishonest. It's intelligent. It requires a secure sense of self underneath all the adaptation. If you don't have a core that feels solid, then adaptation becomes fragmentation and you end up lost. But if you have a core sense of who you are, a clear set of values that remain constant while your presentation shifts, then adaptation becomes a skill rather than a form of identity dissolution. This is why the most powerful people often seem like they don't have a strong personality in the way that rigid people do. They don't broadcast who they are constantly. Instead, they read the room and respond appropriately. They don't insist on being themselves. Instead, they're genuinely interested in who the other person is, what the situation requires, what the context is asking for. And this apparent lack of a strong personality is actually the ultimate strength because it means they're not constantly colliding with reality, not constantly creating enemies through rigidity, not constantly hitting walls that other people seem to slide around. Now let's talk about what this means for situations of actual conflict or competition. A rigid person, when attacked, defends their fixed identity. They react predictably. They show exactly how the attack landed. They reveal where the pressure points are. A fluid person, when attacked, can move. They don't have to defend a fixed identity because they don't have a single fixed identity. They can acknowledge the attack without treating it as a threat to who they are. They can even incorporate parts of it if it's useful. This is what people mean when they talk about someone being unflappable. They're not unflappable because they don't care about anything. They're unflappable because they're not defending a rigid version of themselves that can be threatened. This is also why water is such a powerful metaphor for this kind of power. Water doesn't resist obstacles. It flows around them. It doesn't have a fixed shape. It takes the shape of whatever container it's in. But it's also one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Water can wear down stone. Water can move mountains. Water can destroy buildings. And it does all of this not through direct resistance, but through fluid adaptation. It finds the path of least resistance and follows it, and somehow this results in enormous power. A person who operates like water, who adapts to obstacles rather than rigidly resisting them, who finds paths around resistance rather than charging directly into it, ends up moving through their world with similar power. But here's where we need to acknowledge the ethics of this, because understanding power dynamics means understanding the potential for misuse. Fluidity can become a form of manipulation when someone uses adaptation not to be responsive to context, but to deceive people about their true intentions. There's a difference between someone who adapts their presentation to different contexts while maintaining consistent values and someone who adapts their presentation to extract value from people while having no consistent values underneath. The first is skillful, the second is predatory. And people do sense this difference eventually. The person who adapts from a place of genuine values, who is different with different people because the situation calls for different facets of themselves, maintains trust even as they're fluidly adapting. The person who adapts purely for manipulation, who shifts their presentation depending on what they think will work, often eventually gets caught because people sense the absence of consistent values underneath the adaptive behavior. The key is that true fluidity comes from security, not from desperation. A secure person can be different in different contexts because they're not desperately defending an identity. A desperate person who is trying to be adaptable is actually just trying to manipulate because they're doing it from a place of what do I need to be to get what I want from this person, rather than from a place of how should I authentically respond to what this context is asking for. And people sense that difference. The adaptive person maintains power. The manipulative person eventually loses trust. So here's what fluidity actually means at its best. It means you have a strong core of values and identity, but you don't need to perform that core constantly. You can access different facets of yourself depending on what the situation actually calls for. You can be professional in professional context without it feeling fake, because professionalism is one legitimate part of who you are. You can be playful with friends without it feeling like you're abandoning your serious side, because playfulness is also part of who you are. You can be vulnerable with trusted people without it threatening your strength, because vulnerability is compatible with real strength. You move through the world like water moves through terrain, responsive, adaptive, powerful precisely because you're not rigidly resisting reality. This brings us to a paradox worth sitting with. The person who is most authentically themselves is often not the person insisting on being the same in every context. The person who is most authentically themselves is the person whose authenticity is flexible enough to respond appropriately to whatever situation they're in. They're not performing. They're not pretending. They're responding. And that responsiveness, that fluidity, that willingness to be different things in different contexts is what allows them to navigate social reality with grace and power. Think about every person you know who seems to move through their world effortlessly, who doesn't seem to be constantly struggling against reality, who seems to create alliances rather than enemies, who seems to have opportunities flow toward them. I would wager that nearly all of them are people who are capable of significant fluidity. They're different with different people. They adapt to different contexts. They don't insist on being the same person in every situation. And rather than this fluidity making them seem dishonest, it makes them seem intelligent. It makes them seem emotionally mature. It makes them seem someone worth following. because they're not rigidly colliding with reality. They're flowing around obstacles. They're finding paths that other people don't see because they're not locked into a single way of being. So here's what should follow you. What fixed identity are you defending so rigidly that it's causing you to collide with reality? What aspect of yourself are you insisting on presenting in every single context, regardless of whether that context actually calls for it? And what would become possible if you let yourself be fluid, if you let yourself access different facets of who you already are, if you stopped insisting that authenticity means being the same